Montana Territory, 1872. The unforgiving winter had finally released its grip on the rugged landscape, revealing a vast expanse of rolling hills dotted with wildflowers beneath an endless blue sky. But for Jackson Abernathy, the change of seasons meant nothing. In his world, everything remained as cold and barren as the deepest winter night. Standing at the edge of his meager homestead, Jackson pulled his worn Stetson lower over his piercing blue eyes, surveying what little he had managed to salvage. At 26, his face still held the handsome features of youth, strong jawline dusted with light stubble, high cheekbones bronzed by the sun. But his eyes held the weight of a man who had seen too much. The war had taken his brother, typhoid had claimed his parents, and 3 months ago, outlaws had stolen everything else. No sense in dwelling, he muttered to himself, a habit formed from too many months alone. Jackson believed the frontier had taught him one brutal lesson: attachment was weakness. Love was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. The West demanded solitude and self-reliance. Anything else invited heartbreak or worse. What Jackson wanted was simple: rebuild his cattle herd, strengthen his claim, and survive another season, alone, the way a man should. What he needed, though hidden too deep for him to recognize, was something to heal the emptiness that had settled into his bones long before the outlaws had come. The day that would change everything began ordinarily enough. Jackson had ridden into the growing settlement of Clearwater to purchase supplies. The small Montana town had doubled in size since the railroad spur line had been completed the previous autumn, bringing new settlers eager to claim their piece of the frontier. Jackson Abernathy, the booming voice of Alfred Peterson, the general store owner, greeted him as he entered. "Good to see you, son. Been wondering if you were still out there." "Still breathing," Jackson replied, placing his list on the counter. "Need these loaded by noon if possible." "Possible indeed," Alfred nodded, studying the paper. "Planning to rebuild after those Blackwell boys came through." Jackson's jaw tightened. "One day at a time." Alfred's expression softened. "Town's growing, sheriff's got deputies now, those outlaws won't be coming back." "They always come back," Jackson said flatly, "or someone like them. Nature of things out here." "Not everything's darkness and wolves, son," Alfred said, sorting through sacks of beans. "Speaking of which, we're getting a new schoolteacher next week, Miss Hannah Walters, coming all the way from Boston." "Imagine that." Jackson merely nodded, uninterested in the comings and goings of townsfolk who would never understand the harsh realities of isolated ranch life. As he waited for his supplies, a commotion erupted outside. The sound of a woman's frightened cry cut through the air, followed by the thundering of hooves. Jackson instinctively moved to the door, hand hovering near his pistol. A runaway wagon careened down the main street, its team of horses panicked and directionless. The driver had been thrown, leaving a young woman clutching desperately to the bench seat as the vehicle bounced violently over the rutted road. Without thought, Jackson sprinted into the street, calculating the wagon's trajectory. As it neared, he launched himself toward the lead horse, catching its bridle and digging his heels into the dirt. The momentum nearly tore his arm from its socket, but he held firm, using his weight to gradually turn the team. The wagon slowed, then finally lurched to a stop at the edge of town. Jackson's chest heaved with exertion as he calmed the frightened horses with practiced hands and soothing words. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" he called, turning toward the wagon. The woman sat frozen, her knuckles white where they gripped the seat. Her wide eyes, a striking shade of green, stared at him from beneath a small, fashionable hat that somehow remained perched atop her chestnut hair. She couldn't have been more than 22, dressed in a dusty blue traveling dress that spoke of Eastern origins. "I believe I'm intact," she finally managed, her voice carrying a refined Eastern accent that confirmed she was indeed far from home. "Thanks entirely to you, sir." Jackson approached the wagon and offered his hand. "Let me help you down before these horses change their minds." She hesitated only briefly before placing her gloved hand in his. As she stepped down, her legs buckled slightly, and Jackson steadied her with a hand at her waist. She was slighter than frontier women, her waist narrow beneath his palm. "Thank you, mister," She looked up at him, her face pale but composed. Abernathy, Jackson Abernathy. He released her quickly, uncomfortable with the contact. Hannah Walters, she replied with a small curtsy that seemed oddly formal in the dusty street. I've only just arrived. The stagecoach delivered me to the edge of town, and Mr. Peterson arranged this wagon to take me and my belongings to my accommodations. The driver stopped to speak with someone, and then she gestured to the wagon, words failing. Jackson nodded, suddenly connecting her identity. You're the new schoolteacher. Yes, though I fear this isn't the introduction I had hoped to make. A small crowd had gathered, including the driver, who approached with profuse apologies. Jackson stepped back, his momentary role as rescuer complete. You should see the doctor, he said gruffly. Might have injuries you can't feel yet. Mr. Abernathy, she called as he turned to leave. I don't know how to thank you properly. No need, ma'am, anyone would have done the same. Her green eyes held his for a moment longer than was comfortable. I don't believe that's true at all. Jackson tipped his hat and strode back to the general store, eager to collect his supplies and return to the isolation of his homestead. Yet as he rode out of town, the image of those green eyes stayed with him, an unwelcome disturbance to his carefully maintained solitude. 3 days later, Jackson was mending fence lines when he spotted a rider approaching from the direction of town. Few visitors ever came this far out, and none were welcome. He straightened, hand moving instinctively to his holster as he squinted against the afternoon sun. The rider wore a dark dress, the fabric billowing around slender legs that straddled the horse's side saddle. As she drew closer, Jackson recognized the chestnut hair beneath a modest hat. Miss Walters, he called, his brow furrowed in confusion. Hannah Walters guided her horse to a stop and smiled down at him. Mr. Abernathy. I've found you. Appears so, he replied, removing his hat briefly to wipe his brow. You're a fair piece from town, ma'am. Something wrong? Not at all, she said, accepting his help to dismount. I've come to properly thank you for your heroics the other day. Up close, Jackson could see her fair complexion had already begun to freckle slightly from the Montana sun. Her green eyes seemed even brighter against the forest green of her riding dress. I told you no thanks necessary, he said, stepping back to create distance. Then consider this an official visit, she said, reaching into a satchel hanging from her saddle. As the new teacher, I'm tasked with conducting a census of all school-aged children in the district. No children here, Jackson said flatly. I can see that, she replied, unfazed by his curtness. But I'm also mapping the boundaries of my district. The town council wasn't particularly helpful with specifics. Jackson glanced at the sun's position. It'll be dark before you make it back. Not safe for a woman to ride these trails alone, especially after sundown. I admit I may have underestimated the distance, Hannah conceded. The geography here is quite deceptive. Everything looks closer than it actually is. Jackson sighed, running a hand through his sandy hair. I can escort you back to town. Or, she said, with a hint of calculation that surprised him, you could offer me hospitality for the night, and I could depart at first light. That would be the sensible frontier solution, would it not? Jackson stared at her, wondering at her boldness. Miss Walters, that wouldn't be proper. I assure you, Mr. Abernathy, my reputation has already survived a runaway wagon in full view of the town. I believe it can withstand the gossip of accepting shelter when the alternative is potentially dangerous. Her logic was sound, even if the situation was uncomfortable. I don't have much to offer by way of accommodations. I didn't come west expecting luxury, she replied with a small smile. With reluctance, Jackson led her to his cabin. The structure was small but solid, one main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. A leather curtain separated a small area he'd added for bathing. It's not much, he said, suddenly aware of how sparse his existence was through an outsider's eyes. Hannah moved to the center of the room, turning slowly to take it all in. You built this yourself? Yes, ma'am. 3 years ago. It's quite remarkable, she said, running her fingers along the smooth wood of the table. Solid craftsmanship. Jackson busied himself building a fire, uncomfortable with her presence in his private space. You can take the bed tonight, I'll sleep by the fire. I wouldn't dream of displacing you. It's not up for discussion, he interrupted. I've slept on worse. As the evening progressed, Jackson found himself preparing a more elaborate meal than his usual fare, venison stew with the last of his preserved vegetables. Hannah insisted on helping, her movements graceful despite the unfamiliar setting. How does a Boston lady end up teaching in Montana territory? Jackson asked as they ate, curiosity finally overcoming his reticence. Hannah looked up from her bowl, something guarded passing behind her eyes. The war took my father and brother. My mother passed 2 years ago. Teaching positions are scarce in Boston, particularly for women who need to support themselves fully. So you came to the frontier. Seems a drastic change. The frontier offers what the East increasingly does not, opportunity unbound by convention. She took a sip of water. And you, Mr. Abernathy, what brought you to this isolated patch of Montana? Jackson hesitated, unused to sharing his history. War ended, went home to Tennessee to find nothing left worth staying for, headed west with my brother. He didn't make it past the first winter. I'm sorry, she said softly. Life out here takes more than it gives, he replied, the words coming out harsher than intended. Is that truly what you believe? Hannah asked, her gaze direct and unsettling. That this land only takes. Been my experience. Yet you stay. Jackson had no ready answer for that. Instead, he rose to clear the dishes, ending the conversation that had veered too close to matters he preferred not to examine. That night, lying beside the dying embers of the fire, Jackson listened to the steady breathing of the woman in his bed. Her presence had disturbed something in the careful emptiness of his existence, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples across the surface. Morning came with unexpected warmth. Jackson woke to the smell of coffee and the sight of Hannah moving quietly around his cabin, her hair loose around her shoulders, catching the early light like burnished copper. Good morning, she said, noticing him stir. I hope you don't mind. I found the coffee and thought to have it ready before we depart. Jackson sat up, running a hand through his disheveled hair. No, thank you. They shared a simple breakfast of coffee and cornbread before preparing to ride into town. As Hannah gathered her things, Jackson found himself watching her movements, noting the careful precision with which she pinned up her hair and secured her hat. Mr. Abernathy, she said as he helped her mount. Would you consider something? Depends on what it is, he replied cautiously. The schoolhouse needs repairs before classes can begin next month. The town council has allocated funds but lacks men with proper building skills. She looked down at him from her saddle. Your cabin shows remarkable craftsmanship. Would you consider taking on the work? It would be paid, of course. Jackson hesitated. Town meant people, questions, expectations. I've got plenty to do here. Of course, she said, disappointment evident despite her attempt to hide it. It was presumptuous to ask. They rode in silence for the first hour, the rhythm of the horses' hooves and the occasional call of birds the only sounds. As they crested a hill overlooking a meadow vibrant with spring wildflowers, Hannah drew her horse to a stop. It's breathtaking, she whispered, gazing out over the expanse. I've never seen such colors. Jackson watched her face, struck by the genuine wonder in her expression. For a moment he saw the land through her eyes, not as a harsh mistress demanding constant vigilance, but as something beautiful and alive with possibility. It has its moments, he conceded. Hannah turned to him, her eyes bright. This is why you stay, isn't it, despite everything the frontier has taken from you? Before Jackson could respond, a shot rang out, echoing across the valley. Hannah's horse reared in panic, nearly throwing her. Jackson instinctively moved his mount between her and the direction of the shot, scanning the tree line. Hunters, he said, identifying the source. Careless ones at that, you all right? Hannah nodded, her face pale but composed. Yes, just startled. The incident broke whatever moment had been building between them, and they continued toward town at a brisker pace. As they reached the outskirts, Jackson found himself reluctant to complete the journey. "I'll see about those repairs," he said abruptly. Hannah's smile transformed her face. "Truly. Can't have the territory's children learning in a dangerous building," he replied, trying to sound practical rather than affected by her reaction. "The council will be pleased," she said, "as am I." Jackson tipped his hat. "I'll come to town tomorrow to assess what's needed." As he watched her ride toward the schoolhouse, Jackson told himself his decision was purely practical. The work would provide funds to help rebuild his herd. Yet he knew it wasn't money that had prompted his change of heart, but something far more dangerous to a man determined to remain unattached. The following weeks brought Jackson into town regularly as he worked on the schoolhouse. The building had suffered years of neglect, rotting floorboards, a leaking roof, and windows that no longer closed properly. The work was substantial enough to require his presence daily, often from dawn until dusk. Hannah visited the site each afternoon after completing her census duties, bringing water or sometimes small offerings of food from the town's women, eager to show appreciation for his work. "The council is impressed with your progress," she said one particularly hot afternoon, handing him a cloth-covered basket. "Mrs. Peterson sent these." Jackson wiped his brow and peered into the basket to find fresh biscuits. "Kind of her." "The whole town is talking about your craftsmanship," Hannah said, moving to examine the new window frames he'd installed that morning. "They're quite beautiful." "They're just windows, Miss Walters." "Hannah," she corrected gently. "After sharing your home and watching you transform this building, I believe we've moved beyond formalities." Jackson took a bite of biscuit to avoid responding immediately. Each day this woman chipped away at the walls he'd built around himself, and each day he found it harder to maintain his distance. "These children deserve a proper place to learn," he said finally, focusing on the practical. "They do," Hannah agreed, "as do you deserve more than isolation for your remaining days." Jackson stiffened. "My arrangements suit me fine." "Do they?" she challenged softly. "Is that why you ride into town each day, work until your muscles ache, and linger over dinner at the cafe rather than returning to your cabin?" "The work needs doing," he insisted. "And riding home in the dark isn't always sensible." Hannah stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent that seemed to follow her. "Jackson, the frontier doesn't have to be faced alone. That's why we build towns, communities." "Communities fall," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. "People leave or die or worse." Understanding filled her eyes. "What happened wasn't your fault." Jackson turned away, unable to bear the compassion in her gaze. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Then tell me," she said simply. "Tell me what happened that convinced you solitude is safer than connection." The words stuck in his throat, memories he'd pushed down for months threatening to surface. "I need to finish these windows before sundown," he said instead, reaching for his tools. Hannah didn't press further, but as she left, she placed a hand briefly on his arm. "When you're ready to speak of it, I'll listen." That touch lingered on his skin long after she'd gone, a warmth that both comforted and unsettled him. The schoolhouse neared completion as June bloomed across the territory. Jackson had added touches beyond the council's requirements, carved details on the door frames, a sturdy teacher's desk with a subtle pattern of leaves etched along its edge, bookshelves built into the walls to maximize the small space. On the day he installed the final window, Hannah arrived with unexpected news. "The town is planning a celebration," she announced, her eyes bright with excitement, "for the schoolhouse completion. And to properly welcome me, though I've been here nearly 2 months now." Jackson hammered the last nail into place. "Sounds nice for you." "For us," she corrected, "you're the guest of honor. The council wants to publicly thank you for your exceptional work." He shook his head immediately. "I don't need public thanks, the payment is enough." "Jackson," Hannah said, her voice softening as she used his given name. Over the weeks she'd begun doing so more frequently, and he'd found himself unable to object. The celebration is happening whether you attend or not, but it would mean a great deal to many people, myself included, if you would come. Something in her expression made refusal impossible. When is it? Saturday evening. There will be music and dancing on the new schoolhouse floor, she smiled. A proper christening for the building. Jackson ran a hand through his hair. I don't dance. Everyone dances, Hannah replied with a light laugh. Some just need reminding how. The night of the celebration arrived with uncomfortable speed. Jackson spent an unreasonable amount of time attempting to make himself presentable, shaving carefully, donning his one good shirt, and brushing his rarely worn dark coat. He told himself his efforts were simply respect for the occasion, not for the woman who would be there. The schoolhouse had been transformed. Lanterns hung from the porch and every window glowed with warm light. Inside, the new floor gleamed, and tables lined the walls laden with food brought by the townsfolk. A small group of musicians had set up in one corner, their fiddles and guitars already drawing people to the center of the room. Jackson lingered at the edge of the gathering, nodding acknowledgments to those who approached with thanks or compliments on his work. He scanned the room, searching for Hannah without admitting to himself that was his purpose. When he finally saw her, the air seemed to leave his lungs. She wore a dress of deep blue, simpler than the Eastern fashions she'd arrived in but elegantly tailored to her slender frame. Her chestnut hair was styled in loose curls that framed her face, emphasizing the delicate line of her jaw and the expressive green of her eyes. She stood across the room, engaged in conversation with several women, but as if sensing his presence, she looked up. The smile that lit her face when their eyes met sent an unexpected warmth through Jackson's chest. Hannah excused herself and made her way to him, weaving through the growing crowd with graceful determination. You came, she said, genuine pleasure in her voice. I wasn't certain you would. Said I would, he replied, suddenly aware of how many eyes were watching their interaction. And you're a man of your word, Hannah acknowledged. Come, the council chairman wants to make a formal acknowledgement of your contribution. Before Jackson could protest, she had taken his arm and guided him toward the front of the room. The brief ceremony was mercifully short. A few words of thanks, a round of applause, and the presentation of a small engraved plaque commemorating the schoolhouse completion. As the music resumed and couples began to fill the floor, Hannah remained at his side. Will you dance with me, Jackson? She asked quietly. I told you I don't dance. You told me you don't dance, she corrected. Not that you can't. The distinction hung between them, a challenge he wasn't sure how to answer. Finally, he extended his hand. One dance. Hannah's smile was worth the discomfort as he led her onto the floor. The musicians had begun a waltz, and Jackson found himself recalling steps not used since before the war. Hannah moved with natural grace, following his lead as though they had danced together countless times before. See, your body remembers, she said softly. As they turned around the floor, Jackson became aware of how perfectly she fit in his arms, how natural it felt to hold her. The realization sent a jolt of panic through him. This was precisely what he had vowed to avoid: connection, attachment, the vulnerability that came with caring. Jackson, Hannah's voice broke through his thoughts. Where did you go just now? Nowhere, he said, forcing his attention back to the present. The music ended, but before they could separate, the chairman approached with a broad smile. Abernathy, just the man I wanted to see. The council has another proposition for you. With the schoolhouse complete, we're looking toward building a proper town hall. Your work has impressed everyone. Jackson tensed, torn between the practical need for continued work and his instinct to retreat back to his homestead. I have my own place to tend to. Hannah's hand tightened slightly on his arm. Perhaps Mr. Abernathy could consider the project for the fall, after the summer growing season, she suggested diplomatically. The chairman nodded enthusiastically. Excellent idea, Miss Walters. No rush, Abernathy. Think on it over the summer. The offer stands. As the man moved away, Jackson looked down at Hannah. You didn't need to intercede. You looked ready to flee, she replied with gentle understanding. I merely offered a compromise that might serve everyone's needs. Jackson led her off the dance floor, suddenly needing air. I should be getting back. It's barely 8 o'clock, Hannah protested, and it's a celebration in your honor. I've been honored enough, he said, the walls he'd momentarily lowered now firmly back in place. The farm needs attention. Disappointment flickered across her face, but she nodded. Of course. Thank you for the dance, Jackson. He tipped his hat and turned to leave, ignoring the curious glances from townsfolk as he made his way to the door. Outside, the night air cooled his flushed face as he untied his horse from the hitching post. Running again. The voice startled him. Sheriff Daniels stood in the shadows of the porch, pipe glowing softly in the darkness. Just heading home, Jackson replied stiffly. Seems to me you've been heading home for 3 years now, the sheriff observed. Ever since what happened with the Miller family. Jackson's hand froze on the reins. That's not your concern. Maybe not, the older man agreed. But that schoolteacher in there, she deserves to know why you're so determined to keep everyone at arm's length, especially her. There's nothing between Miss Walters and me. The sheriff's low chuckle held no humor. Son, the only 2 people in this town who believe that are you and her, and I'm not sure about her anymore. Jackson mounted his horse, eager to escape the conversation and the emotions threatening to overwhelm his carefully maintained control. Good night, Sheriff. As he rode through the darkness toward his homestead, Jackson's mind filled with unwelcome memories. The Miller family had settled 2 miles from his place 3 years ago, John and Sarah with their 2 young children. Good people working hard to build a life. Jackson had helped them raise their cabin, shared meals with them, watched their children while they went to town. When the fever came, it took the youngest child first, then Sarah. Jackson had ridden through a blizzard to fetch the doctor, but by the time they returned, John too had succumbed, leaving only 6-year-old Emma, herself weakened by the illness. Jackson had cared for her as best he could, but the fever eventually claimed her too. 4 graves he dug in frozen ground, each one hardening the resolve that had formed in his heart. Attachment meant inevitable loss. Better to never form those bonds than to suffer their severing. Yet Hannah Walters had somehow slipped past his defenses, awakening feelings he'd thought safely buried alongside the Miller family. The realization terrified him more than any physical danger the frontier could present. The following week passed in solitude as Jackson threw himself into work on his homestead. He avoided town entirely, focusing on repairing fences, tending his small herd, and preparing his fields for planting. Physical exhaustion became his shield against thoughts of Hannah and the connection he'd begun to feel with her. On the 7th day, as afternoon stretched toward evening, the sound of approaching hooves pulled Jackson from his work. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow, and turned to find Hannah riding toward him. She wore a simple riding dress of forest green, her hair partially loose beneath a wide-brimmed hat that protected her fair skin from the sun. Even from a distance, he could see determination in the set of her shoulders. "Miss Walters," he called as she drew closer, "this is becoming a habit." "One you forced by your absence," she replied, dismounting without waiting for his assistance. "The children are disappointed. They wanted to thank you for their new schoolhouse." Guilt flickered through him. "I'm not good with children." "That's not what I heard from Mrs. Miller before she passed," Hannah said quietly. Jackson froze, the name hitting him like a physical blow. "Who told you about them?" "Sheriff Daniels, after you left the celebration." She stepped closer, her green eyes searching his face. "He thought I should understand what happened." "He had no right," Jackson said, anger and old grief making his voice harsh. "Perhaps not," Hannah acknowledged, "but I'm glad he did. Jackson, what happened to the Miller family wasn't your fault." "I know that," he snapped. "Do you? Because you've been punishing yourself for 3 years as though somehow by caring for them, you invited their tragedy." Jackson turned away, unable to bear the compassion in her gaze. "You don't understand." "I understand loss," she said softly. I understand the temptation to wall yourself off from the possibility of pain, but that's not living, Jackson, that's just existing. It's safer, he insisted, is it? Look around you, Hannah gestured to the isolated homestead. One man alone on the frontier, no one to watch your back, tend your wounds, share your burdens. How is that safer? Her words struck with uncomfortable accuracy. Jackson had told himself his solitude was protective, but in truth, it made him vulnerable in countless practical ways. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally, the question emerging more plaintive than he'd intended. Hannah stepped closer, close enough that he could see the sunlight catching the gold flecks in her green eyes. "I want you to stop running from connection, from possibility." She paused, gathering courage. "From me?" The air between them seemed charged with unspoken emotion. Jackson felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble beneath the weight of her honest gaze. "I don't know how," he admitted, the words barely audible. "Yes, you do," she said simply. "You just need to remember." Before he could respond, the distant sound of a gunshot echoed across the valley, followed quickly by another. Jackson's head snapped up, instantly alert. The shots had come from the direction of the main road, perhaps a mile distant. "Stay here," he ordered, already moving toward his hitching post where his rifle rested in its scabbard. "I'm coming with you," Hannah replied, following close behind. "It could be dangerous." "All the more reason not to face it alone," she countered, already mounting her horse. Jackson had no time to argue. Together they rode toward the source of the gunfire, approaching cautiously as they neared the road. The sound of men's voices carried on the wind, followed by a woman's frightened cry. From the cover of a small ridge, they saw the source of the disturbance, a family's wagon surrounded by 3 mounted men, their faces partially concealed by bandanas. The father stood protectively before his wife and young daughter, his hands raised in surrender as one of the men held him at gunpoint. "Those are the Blackwell brothers," Jackson whispered, recognizing the distinctive dun horse belonging to the oldest brother. "They've been raiding homesteads and robbing travelers for months." Hannah's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "What can we do?" Jackson assessed the situation quickly. "I'll circle around, come at them from behind. When you hear my shot, get the family to cover if you can." "Be careful," she whispered as he turned to go. "Hannah," he said, pausing, "if anything happens to me, ride for town, don't try to help." "Promise me." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I promise to do what's necessary." It wasn't the assurance he wanted, but it was all she would give. Jackson nodded once, then moved silently through the trees, circling to approach the road from behind the outlaws. The Blackwells were focused on their victims, carelessly confident in their superior numbers. As Jackson crept closer, he could hear the oldest brother demanding valuables, threatening the child if the father didn't comply. The family looked eastern, probably new arrivals heading for unclaimed land further west. They had no chance against experienced frontier predators like the Blackwells. Jackson took careful aim at the leader's shoulder, a wounding shot rather than a killing one. He squeezed the trigger, and the outlaw toppled from his horse with a cry of pain. Before the others could locate the source of the shot, Jackson fired again, striking the second brother's leg. Chaos erupted as the wounded men shouted in confusion. Jackson emerged from cover, rifle trained on the remaining outlaw. "Drop your weapon," he commanded, "or join your brothers on the ground." From the corner of his eye, he saw Hannah moving swiftly toward the family, guiding them to shelter behind their wagon. The father had produced a pistol from somewhere and was covering his family's retreat. The third Blackwell brother hesitated only briefly before raising his hands in surrender. The wounded men cursed but remained where they'd fallen, their injuries preventing any heroics. "Hannah, take the family's wagon and get to town," Jackson called, keeping his rifle trained on the outlaws. "Bring the sheriff back." "What about you?" she called back, concern evident in her voice. "I'll keep these 3 company until you return." The father of the family approached cautiously. "My wife can drive the wagon." "I'll stay and help you watch them." Jackson nodded his thanks. Within minutes, Hannah was leading the wagon toward town, casting one worried glance back at Jackson before disappearing around a bend in the road. The hours of waiting passed tensely, with Jackson and the traveler, a banker named Harrison from Pennsylvania, keeping careful watch over the increasingly sullen Blackwell brothers. "You've saved our lives," Harrison said quietly. "Those men would have killed us once they had what they wanted." "Probably," Jackson agreed, his eyes never leaving the outlaws. "You live out here alone." "I do." Harrison shook his head. "Brave man. After today, I'm questioning the wisdom of bringing my family to such wild country." "The frontier isn't inherently cruel," Jackson found himself saying, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "It's just unforgiving of carelessness. Travel in groups, learn from those who have survived here, build connections with neighbors." As the sun began to set, the sound of approaching horses signaled the sheriff's arrival. Hannah rode beside him, her face lighting with relief when she saw Jackson unharmed. "Abernathy," Sheriff Daniels called as he dismounted, "seems you've had an eventful afternoon." While the sheriff and his deputies secured the Blackwell brothers, Jackson moved to where Hannah waited, her eyes never leaving his face. "You're unharmed?" she asked softly. "Not a scratch," he assured her. "Mr. Harrison told me what you did," she said. "You could have killed those men easily from cover, but you chose to wound them instead." Jackson shrugged uncomfortably. "They're still men, however misguided. Killing should never be the first choice." Hannah's expression softened. "For someone determined to appear hardened by the frontier, you possess remarkable compassion." Before he could respond, Sheriff Daniels approached. "These three have been terrorizing the territory for months. You've done everyone a service today, Abernathy." "Just happened to be in the right place," Jackson demurred. "Nonetheless, there's a reward posted for their capture. It'll be yours once they're sentenced." The sheriff turned to Hannah. "Miss Walters, perhaps you'd be willing to put up Mr. Harrison's family for the night. Their wagon took some damage in the excitement." "Of course," Hannah agreed readily. "There's plenty of room at Mrs. Thompson's boarding house." As the group prepared to return to town, Harrison approached Jackson and Hannah. "I don't know how to thank you both properly." "No thanks necessary," Jackson replied. "Perhaps not necessary, but certainly deserved," Harrison insisted. "If you'll permit me, I'd like to host a dinner in your honor once we're settled. My family and I owe you our lives." Jackson began to decline, but Hannah spoke first. "We would be honored, Mr. Harrison. Once you're settled, send word through the school." As Harrison moved away, Jackson raised an eyebrow. "We?" Hannah met his gaze steadily. "Yes, we. Unless you intend to continue avoiding me after today's events." The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. Jackson found himself smiling despite his determination to maintain his emotional distance. "I suppose avoiding you has proven rather pointless." "Completely," she agreed, a tentative smile forming. "Does this mean you'll escort me to town without another 3-year retreat to your homestead?" Jackson hesitated only briefly. "Yes, ma'am, I believe it does." The ride back to town as twilight deepened around them felt different from any journey Jackson had made in years. The presence of Hannah beside him, the shared experience of danger faced together, had shifted something fundamental between them. "Will you tell me about them?" Hannah asked quietly as they rode, "the Miller family." Jackson's first instinct was refusal, but something in her gentle tone made the protective walls around those memories seem suddenly unnecessary. "John Miller was from Ohio," he began, the words coming slowly at first, then with increasing ease. "Brought his family west after the war, good man, hard worker. Sarah could make bread that would make you believe in miracles. Their boy Thomas was only 4, bright as a new penny, and Emma," his voice faltered slightly. "Emma had the biggest blue eyes you ever saw, always asking questions about everything." As he spoke of the family that had briefly been his neighbors and almost his friends, Jackson felt a weight lifting, not completely, but enough to breathe more freely than he had in years. Hannah listened without interruption, her presence beside him a silent comfort. "I buried them on their land," he concluded, "marked the graves proper, Visit sometimes to make sure the markers are still standing. You honored them, Hannah said softly. Not just in death, but in how you cared for them in life. Jackson looked over at her, struck by the understanding in her eyes. I couldn't save them. No one could have, she replied. Not the doctor, not God himself once that fever took hold, but you didn't abandon them. That matters, Jackson. They rode in silence for a time, the town lights becoming visible in the distance. As they approached, Jackson found himself reluctant for the journey to end. Would you consider having dinner with me tomorrow, he asked suddenly, at the cafe? Hannah's smile lit her face. I would like that very much. The weeks that followed brought changes to Jackson's life that would have been unimaginable months before. Regular dinners with Hannah became the highlight of his week. He found reasons to come to town, supplies needed, books borrowed, assistance offered to neighbors. Each visit included time with Hannah, walking along the town's growing streets or sitting on the schoolhouse porch as evening fell. Their conversations ranged widely. Hannah spoke of her life in Boston, her dreams of building a proper school in the territory, her belief in education as the foundation of civilization. Jackson shared stories of his travels west, the beauty and challenge of taming a small piece of the frontier, his growing herd of cattle. What neither spoke of directly was the changing nature of their relationship. Yet it was evident to everyone who saw them together. The way Jackson's expression softened when Hannah entered a room, the way her eyes sought him in a crowd, the unconscious synchronicity of their movements when they walked side by side. Summer bloomed across the territory, bringing long days of sunshine and growth. Jackson divided his time between his homestead and town, finding a balance that would have seemed impossible before Hannah entered his life. One warm July evening, they sat on the schoolhouse steps after Hannah had finished preparing for the coming term. The setting sun painted the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples, casting long shadows across the town's main street. I received a letter today, Hannah said, breaking a comfortable silence. From the Territorial Education Board. Something in her tone made Jackson turn to look at her. Good news or bad? They're offering me a position in Helena, she said carefully, overseeing the development of educational standards for the entire territory. Jackson felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. That's quite an opportunity. It is, she agreed, her eyes studying his face. It would mean leaving Clearwater, of course. The familiar instinct to withdraw, to protect himself from inevitable loss, rose swiftly. Jackson fought against it, forcing himself to remain present in the moment. When would you go? He asked, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. I haven't accepted, Hannah replied. I wanted to discuss it with you first. Why? It's your decision to make. Hannah's expression flickered between hurt and determination. Because what happens between us matters to me, Jackson. Because I care for you deeply, and I believe you care for me too, despite your best efforts not to. The directness of her words left no room for evasion. Jackson looked out across the town, gathering his thoughts. I do care for you, he admitted finally, more than I thought possible after everything that happened. Then talk to me, she urged. Tell me what you're thinking. Jackson took a deep breath. I'm thinking that you should take the position. It's an opportunity you deserve. Your intelligence, your dedication to education, they shouldn't be limited to one small town. And us? Hannah asked quietly. Helena is a long way from here. It doesn't have to be, she said, her voice gaining strength. You could come with me. There's nothing holding you to your homestead that couldn't be rebuilt elsewhere. The suggestion startled him. Leave my land. Land is just land, Jackson. It's the people who matter. Hannah reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his. You taught me that, even if you've been trying to convince yourself otherwise. Jackson looked down at their joined hands, feeling the gentle strength in her grip. I don't know if I can start over again. You already have, she said softly. The moment you decided to help repair the schoolhouse, the moment you danced with me. The moment you told me about the Millers. Her words resonated with a truth he couldn't deny. Each of those moments had been a small step away from isolation, toward something he'd convinced himself he neither wanted nor deserved. "I need time to think," he said finally. Hannah nodded, disappointment visible in her eyes though she tried to hide it. "Of course, the board doesn't need my answer for 2 weeks." The ride back to his homestead that night was solitary and silent. Jackson's mind churned with conflicting emotions, fear of change warring with the undeniable pull he felt toward Hannah, the security of his established life against the uncertainty of following her to Helena. As he approached his cabin, the familiar silhouette against the starlit sky should have brought comfort. Instead, for the first time since building it, the structure looked oddly empty, not a home but merely a shelter. The following days passed in a haze of work and indecision. Jackson avoided town, throwing himself into physical labor that left little energy for thought. Yet Hannah remained present in his mind, her face appearing whenever he closed his eyes. On the 5th day, as Jackson repaired a section of fence damaged during a recent thunderstorm, the sound of an approaching wagon drew his attention. To his surprise, it was not Hannah but Sheriff Daniels who pulled to a stop beside the fence line. "Abernathy," the older man called in greeting. "Thought I might find you out here wearing yourself to exhaustion." Jackson wiped sweat from his brow. "Something I can help you with, Sheriff." "Maybe it's something I can help you with," Daniels replied, climbing down from his wagon. "Heard Miss Walters got an offer from Helena." Jackson returned to his work, hammering with perhaps more force than necessary. "News travels fast." "Small towns," the sheriff shrugged. "Also heard you've been making yourself scarce since she told you." "My business is my own," Jackson said tersely. "Usually I'd agree with you," Daniels said, leaning against the fence post. "But I've watched you these past months, seen you coming back to life after 3 years of walking around like half a man." "That woman did that." Jackson paused, the hammer suspended mid-swing. "I never asked her to." "No, and that's what makes it remarkable," the sheriff observed. "She saw something in you worth saving when you were determined to waste away out here alone." "I wasn't wasting away," Jackson protested. "I was surviving." "There's a difference between surviving and living," Daniels said, his weathered face serious. "I fought in the war too, lost more friends than I care to count, came west thinking I'd leave all that behind, start fresh. But there's no starting fresh if you don't let yourself live fully." Jackson set down his hammer, suddenly tired of pretense. "What if I follow her and something happens? What if I lose her too?" The sheriff's expression softened with understanding. "That's the risk we all take, son, every day with every person we care about. The Millers didn't die because you cared about them. They died because life is fragile, especially out here. And that's supposed to make me feel better about risking everything again." "No," Daniel said simply. "It's supposed to make you understand that the risk is inevitable. The only choice you have is whether to face it alone or with someone by your side." The words struck Jackson with unexpected force. He had been so focused on avoiding pain that he'd failed to see how his isolation had become a different kind of suffering. "She deserves better than a broken-down cowboy with nothing but a small homestead to his name," he said quietly. "Maybe so," the sheriff agreed, "but she's chosen you all the same. Seems to me that's her decision to make, not yours." After Daniels departed, Jackson stood looking out over his land as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The property that had been his refuge and his prison for 3 years suddenly seemed less substantial than the feeling that had grown in his chest whenever Hannah smiled at him. The next morning Jackson rode into town before dawn, reaching the schoolhouse just as the eastern sky began to lighten. He dismounted and sat on the steps, waiting. Hannah arrived 2 hours later, stopping in surprise when she saw him. She wore a simple blue dress, her chestnut hair braided and pinned up, tendrils escaping to frame her face. "Jackson," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I didn't expect to see you." He stood, suddenly nervous in a way gunfights and frontier dangers had never made him. "I needed to talk to you about Helena." Hope flickered across her face, quickly contained. "I'm listening." "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, "about land being just land. About starting over." "And," she prompted when he paused. Jackson took a deep breath. "I built that homestead thinking it would be enough, a place that was mine where I could be self-sufficient, not needing anyone. But these past months with you have shown me how empty that life was." Hannah stepped closer, her green eyes never leaving his face. "What are you saying, Jackson?" "I'm saying I don't want to go back to that emptiness," he said, the words coming more easily now. "I'm saying that if you go to Helena, I want to go with you, if you'll have me." The joy that transformed her face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Of course I'll have you. Did you truly doubt it?" "I doubted everything except how I feel about you," Jackson admitted. "And even that frightened me." "Does it still?" she asked softly. "Yes," he said honestly, "but staying behind frightens me more." Hannah closed the distance between them, reaching up to touch his face gently. "We don't have to have all the answers now. We just have to be willing to find them together." Jackson covered her hand with his own, turning to press a kiss to her palm. "Together sounds better than anything I've heard in a long time." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. Jackson sold his homestead to a family newly arrived from Minnesota, a couple with 3 young children who looked at the small cabin with the same hope he had felt 3 years earlier. He kept his cattle, arranging to move the small herd to grazing land outside Helena. Hannah submitted her acceptance to the territorial board and spent her final days in Clearwater, ensuring her replacement was prepared to continue the work she had begun. The town organized a farewell celebration that became, by unspoken agreement, an engagement party as well. On their last night in Clearwater, Jackson took Hannah to the ridge overlooking his former homestead. The autumn air carried a hint of the winter to come as they sat side by side, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold. "Are you certain you won't regret leaving?" Hannah asked, her head resting against his shoulder. "You built a life here." "I built a shelter here," Jackson corrected gently. "I'm building a life with you." She smiled up at him, the fading sunlight catching in her eyes. "When did you become such a poet, Jackson Abernathy?" "Must be your influence," he replied, pulling her closer. "You've changed me in ways I'm still discovering." "As you have changed me," she said softly. "I came west seeking independence, a place to prove my worth beyond the confines of Boston society. I never expected to find a partner who would see me as an equal." Jackson looked down at her, struck anew by the remarkable woman who had chosen to share her future with him. "I love you, Hannah Walters, more than I thought possible after everything that happened." "And I love you," she replied, raising her face to his. "Not despite your scars, but because of how you've learned to carry them." Their kiss, tender and filled with promise, sealed the understanding between them. That life on the frontier would always contain hardship and loss, but faced together, it could also hold joy beyond measure. 3 days later, as their wagon joined the stagecoach road leading to Helena and new beginnings, Jackson glanced back once at the town that had been the setting for his transformation. The schoolhouse stood solid and welcoming at the edge of town, a testament to what could be built after destruction. Beside him, Hannah followed his gaze. "We'll come back to visit," she promised. "Yes," Jackson agreed, turning to face forward once more. "But first, we have a future to build." As the wagon crested the hill and Clearwater disappeared from view, Jackson felt not loss but anticipation. The road ahead might be uncertain, but for the first time in years, he faced it not as a solitary survivor, but as a man rediscovering the courage to love in the midst of life's inevitable risks. The Montana sky stretched endlessly above them, vast and full of possibility, much like the unexpected, beautiful love that had found him when he least expected it, bringing him home at last.